Hey, so this is just a short bonus video about William Gossett, who is the person who discovered the t-distribution. And if you've been watching the chapter 10 videos, you would know that the t-distribution is important because this idea that if we don't know what the standard deviation is, especially for smaller sample sizes, we have to make our distribution a little bit wider to account for that. So William Gossett was a British and English scientist. His father was a colonel in the Royal Engineers, and he couldn't do that because he had bad eyesight. So instead he studied chemistry and maths. Of course, people in England always say maths instead of math. And when he graduated, his father thought he might become a lawyer or maybe become a member of parliament or do something important. But instead he took a job with Guinness. Now, Guinness makes beer, and not just any beer, but they make Guinness beer, which is a stout. It's a very dark beer. It's almost black. It's much different in consistency and texture than other beers. It's made in Ireland, which if you think about the early 1900s, the difference between England and Ireland was a big deal. Ireland was still part of Great Britain. It became independent in the after World War I. And this idea that he went to work for Guinness was sort of crazy. And his dad thought that, that's a ridiculous idea. And what he did was they hired him specifically to try to find how he can tell whether or not the beer was going to be good based off its chemical consistency, because he was somebody who majored in both chemistry and maths. He was able to look at the hops and find the difference in these percentages between these two kinds of hops that they had. And up until that time, they knew about the Z distribution, but he couldn't really figure out how he could do it with these smaller sample sizes. And so what he did was he started collecting data to figure out how that would go. And I'm zipping through this webpage so that, I have linked to it in the description so you can read it a little bit more slowly. But what he was able to do was to find that this hops difference really was important, because he could take a whole bunch of very small samples and do a whole bunch of comparisons very quickly as a result. So he wanted to work out the mathematics of it, and they let him go talk to Carl Pearson. Carl Pearson was one of the founders of modern statistics. And he wanted to publish his answers, but Guinness didn't really want him to, because they were sort of embarrassed that they were using science, right? Beer isn't made with science. Beer is made as a craft with love. You put your whole life into learning how to make good beer. And this idea that this chemist who's still pretty young could come and help make their beer better was something they didn't really want to do. And they also were kind of worried that once they got out that chemistry could help you make better beer, other people would figure this out and they would lose sort of this competitive advantage they have. So he had to use a pseudonym, and he had to actually collect different data. So he actually collected data about insomnia. So he had people to see how they would fall asleep at night. And so what he would do is he would have people come to an inn, and you remember inns in the old days, you had a tavern and then rooms to sleep in up above. And he would give them different drinks, and he would see how long it took them to fall asleep, and he would measure his data. Some of them got warm milk. And in fact, he had good evidence. One of the first to actually publish sort of the scientific reasoning of why warm milk helps you fall asleep. But he had tea, he had coffee. Of course, coffee doesn't help you fall asleep. And he had beer. And it turns out beer actually is also good to help you fall asleep, although not in the same way that warm milk or just water would work. Anyway, he used that data when he published his results, because Guinness so much didn't want to share the beer data that they had collected very carefully as part of the corporate thing. So anyway, this is just a little side note. I linked to that webpage if you want to read more about Gossett. If you ever watch commercials for Guinness, they actually often have his little picture. There was a whole campaign a few years ago where little cardboard guys, little cartoon guys would talk, and they would go, "Brilliant." And Gossett was one of those guys in the ad campaign. So anyway, in a way, Gossett was not a very famous person. He worked at Guinness pretty much his whole career. During World War I, actually, London called him, and he worked in the mathematical office of the War Office. So he did code breaking and stuff like that. And of course, code breaking was different in World War I than World War II, which is where all the stories about cool code breaking in London was done. but he was part of that effort, and people sort of thought it was weird. Why are you bringing this guy from the beer company over to help us break codes? But everyone realized that he was actually very brilliant at it, and they did that when Ireland and England split, and Ireland became its own country, separate from Great Britain. He stayed in Ireland, and he worked his whole career doing that. So anyway, Gossett's kind of one of the cool people in the history of statistics. And especially since right after that is when statistics started to be used by the Nazis for horrible things. We like to talk about Gossett because he really was sort of showing how we could use statistics to make things their best, right? Making good beer. So there you go.